So I wanted to start by saying how wonderful it is actually just being here and seeing the work on the walls. I mean, this has been a long time in preparation, and it's just really wonderful to be able to actually just spend some time with the work and to hold the catalogue in our hands. Seeing all this research, it's more than a year, it's several years on Aoife's part, and we've been, myself and the other contributors have been involved in a long research process as well. So it's really wonderful to see all of that coming to fruition. So it was last summer, 2020, when Aoife invited me to be part of this process, to undertake a body of research and to co-edit the resulting catalogue for this exhibition of Nano Reid's work. And it's the first such exhibition of Reid's work in quite a long time, as many of you know, so it's really valuable and really important, I think. I'd known Reid's work prior to this, of course. Primarily I knew her work of the 40s and 50s through my own sort of associated research on British and Irish art of that period. So one area that I'd looked at in particular was at developments in patronage and cultural diplomacy before, during and after the Second World War in Britain and in Ireland. And I think Reid is a really interesting figure in this respect. She was early in her career and right the way through the recipient of a lot of official support. During the war, she was seen as an artist whose work could be instrumentalised actually in the development of British-Irish relations. Britain at this point was looking at cultural diplomacy as a form of soft power, and they were, it's something that's not really well remembered now, but they were courting Ireland as a neutral nation and sort of trying to keep the Irish on side through these forms of sort of patronage and cultural diplomacy. And there's an interesting story, I won't go into it in too much depth, this is something I write about in the text. John Betjeman, the poet, was in Ireland at that time. There's lots of stories have sort of circulated about him being a spy and being involved in, we don't know to what extent. We know he was working for the Ministry of Information, and he was very close friends with Kenneth Clarke, who was the director of the National Gallery in London. And so he writes to Clarke in 1941 after seeing Reid's work, and he says, I've seen this amazing exhibition by this wonderful young Irish artist. And this is one of her solo shows at the Dublin Painters Gallery. And he says, you don't know how valuable it would be to show a body of work by an artist like this in London, how much value that would have in terms of this kind of, I suppose, soft propaganda. So they did organise an exhibition of Reid's work in the Redfern Gallery in 1941. This is just a couple of months before the big Jack B. Yeats show at the National Gallery, so it's part of the same conversation that's going on. But it's really interesting that Reid is the artist that's selected at this point. Reid's work is really, it's being recognised already at this level. So yeah, and then, I mean, we see the same thing repeated in the years after the war. The Irish authorities are obviously looking at culture as a way to rehabilitate maybe their international reputation. You know, Ireland was ostracised after their position of neutrality during the war, and so when we look at the official records, people are really starting to think about culture and how we can sort of take Irish culture abroad and what it can do for these kinds of, again, this kind of cultural diplomacy. And so, yes, this is the kind of background for the first ever Irish representation at Venice in 1950. And again, here, Reid is one of the artists selected alongside Nora McGuinness. That selection is, it's George Furlong, who was director of the National Gallery, and there's a succession of the directors of the gallery who are big supporters of Reid. So Thomas McGreevy and James White are also committed to Reid's work later on. So I say all this just to give a sense of the kinds of admiration and patronage that Reid was able to command. We see that in later international contexts too. Her work is selected for many important touring exhibitions, the Guggenheim International Award exhibition in New York in 1960 being one case in point, the touring 12 Irish Painters show in 1963, and the New York World Fair in 1964, the Irish Pavilion there. There's also, I think, an interesting trajectory that follows the specifics of the kind of aftermath of her showing in London. So she shows at George's Gallery in 1950, which is a gallery that's being run by Bia Bondi Jaray, who is a Jewish emigrant in London, and part of a sort of network of Jewish dealers and curators that includes Erica Browsen, who runs the Hanover Gallery. She shows Nano Reid in 1952. So at that point, she's on a programme alongside artists like Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud, Isabel Rawsthorne, and many others. So there are these interesting moments where she's being aligned with particular kind of contemporary trends within art, within visual art. I say all this, yet at the same time, what I found when I started to really look into Reid was that she's quite a contradictory figure. It doesn't feel as though she was courting this kind of support necessarily. She seems to have been uncomfortable with the kind of wheeling and dealing that was increasingly required by artists, the need to self-promote. She seems to have been, in fact, a quite principled person about this drive, this necessity that was being forced onto artists. And often what we see is we see her refusing to cooperate or to conform to what was expected of her. Her social circles were determinedly bohemian, unconventional, and she doesn't seem to have curried favour with people. She seems to have detested openings. I'm sure some of us probably can empathise with that. So actually this level of support is really, it's all the more impressive that there was so much admiration and commitment to Reid's work on the part of so many. And I think it's important she also refused to settle into what she considered the establishment. I think it's very telling that she, with Gerard Dillon, exhibited work as part of the first exhibition of the Independent Artists Group in 1960. This new generation of vanguard artists that included people like Barry Cook, Camille Souter, Gerda Frommel, Edward Maguire, and several others, of course. And then later again in the 1970s, and this is something maybe some of the people in the room might know more about, because it was something I was really fascinated by, but I suppose it's an element of the research that feels like a starting point rather than an end. But in the 70s, her work is being shown alongside the work of the Figurative Image Group, who have their first show in Wexford in 1974. They're a group that position themselves in between representation and abstraction. They say they're sort of working somewhere in the intersection of those things. And obviously to these artists, Reid is a sort of heroic figure in a way. And so she's certainly showing with them by the late 70s. And we know in particular Camille Souter was somebody who had a huge amount of admiration for Reid. Anyway, that's maybe an aside, but I'd be interested if anybody knows a little more about that. So I think what we're seeing in terms of these groupings is it's indicative of Reid's own refusal of the logic of the establishment. I think that she felt a need for a kind of continuous reinvention and replenishment of her own work and of art in general. I think she really resisted the idea that she might settle into a style, that she might settle into a comfortable position. And no doubt, I think this came at least in part from her background. She wasn't poor by any means. Her family were well off, middle class, merchants and publicans. But equally, she didn't have the same inherited social capital as many of her peers in the art world in Dublin. She went to art school on a scholarship, 2 years as a teacher in training, 1 year as an art scholar. And I think she did feel like something of an outsider in the Dublin art world. And I think this is part of why she felt such a bond with artists like Gerard Dillon, sort of Northern Irish working class artists, and Daniel O'Neill, of course. And I think these friendships fortified her to refuse to participate in what she called, according to Piers Hutchinson, the Philistine, mercenary or snobbish aspects of the Irish art world, as she saw them. And for me, and this is the conclusion that I come to, or the argument that I make in my contribution to the catalogue, this pattern of refusals, and actually I think it culminates in her ultimate refusal of the city, when in 1962 she returns to live in Drogheda with her sisters. Because on the face of it, that's a pretty unorthodox decision for an artist to make in that environment. Dublin was it was the infrastructural centre for the visual arts. It was the focal point where the private galleries, the studios, the public institutions and the commercial outlets of the art market were clustered. And it was also home to many of the other painters and writers with whom Reid was connected, her professional and her personal network, her friends. She was regarded as one of the major Irish artists of her generation. She'd lived in the city for 30 years. So the decision to leave does seem, at least at first, unorthodox. But of course, Reid was unorthodox. She wasn't interested in doing things in the customary way. And of course, as everybody here knows, Drogheda and the Boyne Valley had been, for some time, the main source and subject of her work. She was drawn to the ancient landscapes of the Boyne, with their special significance in Celtic mythology. And so during the 50s, she found herself returning to this place again and again, and to the environs of Drogheda. So her work includes many rural sort of landscapes centering on these mythological sites, but also depictions of the urban environment of Drogheda. A number of clear motifs are beginning to recur in the work too. Celtic carvings, circular forms, the sea. So in this sense, by returning to Drogheda in '62, she's yielding to the places that had always informed her work. It is true she also left, at least in part, because of the financial demands of the city. And I think that's also really telling. So that, in spite of her preeminence, she's recognised, as I say, as one of the most significant artists of her generation, yet she's unable to earn enough to go on living in the city, which is testament to some significant dysfunctionality, I would say. And obviously there are some resonances today in terms of artists being forced out of cities because they're just becoming more and more unaffordable. Now, Reid didn't use the language of feminism, to my knowledge, but she was intensely aware of the mechanisms of class and patriarchy that governed the distribution of resources, opportunities and cultural capital within the art world, but also more broadly in mid-20th century Ireland. She was all too familiar with and critical of the entrenched bias of the cultural establishment. And it is, we noticed it as we were putting the catalogue together. When you look at the record, Reid's work is just not written up to the same extent as some of her male peers. So we were relying a lot on newspaper coverage, reviews, occasional interviews, but really there's a dearth of that sort of longer form critical writing dedicated to Reid, and it is a gap. So I think that her refusal, and again this is something that I frame in the essay, I think that her refusal can be categorized within a broader feminist tradition of refusal. And yeah, anyway, that's something that I go into in more depth. I won't talk more about it now. But I suppose what I wanted to say was that there are a lot of reasons for her departure from the city and her return to Drogheda. And I think it had knock-on effects. I think for some dealers and audiences, her departure led to her being described or known as an artist of the 50s. She'd left and that was that. As if leaving the city were a sort of line drawn under her career. Yet what happens is that here in Drogheda, she continues to innovate and develop. Her work evolves, becoming ever more embedded in the places from which she drew her creative nourishment. What this meant was that Reid's commitment to this place didn't mean settling into some particular style. In fact, her work underwent several further shifts in the decades she spent in Drogheda. She was an artist who, as Dorothy Walker noted, never stood still. And Walker argued that, she said, although Reid is generally thought of as a painter of the 50s, in fact, according to Walker, her best paintings were made in the 60s. And Walker singles out Tinkers at Sleeve Braid to show how her work speaks directly out of the paint. This is Walker's speaking, before one has seen what the picture is about, it has an abstract expression of its own, conveyed by the colour of the paint, the thickness of the paint, the movement of the paint, absolutely direct from brush to viewer, with no intrusion or curtain of illustrative ideas. And Walker goes on to compare Reid's work with that of Philip Guston. And she's not the only one to connect Reid's work to the action painters, to abstract expressionism. Roisin Kennedy has written about, in her contribution to the catalogue, some parallels with Jackson Pollock. And I'm sure Roisin will speak about that when she's on shortly. So I think what's important to note here is that Reid's work, as she describes it, emerges from the land, it emerges from the specifics of the place she loves. She talked about this at some length in a radio interview for BBC Northern Ireland in 1974, where she said, "What started me off was an interest in the prehistoric Irish remains. An interest grew up around all that, and the natural thing was to paint it. I looked around me and painted what appealed to me in an emotional way. The thing is, I have to have a subject that I feel about. The only ones I feel about are those places." Sorry, I think I've missed a word there. "There is no use in trying to paint a place I have no feeling for. The essence of a place is very important to me." So Reid's attraction to this feeling of a place was profound and emotional. Interestingly, it was not archaeological. When excavations did occasionally take place, or when the big excavations of Newgrange started in the 60s, Reid immediately lost interest. She wasn't really interested in exposing or revealing or removing the mystery of the landscape. And so in a somewhat cantankerous interview with the Irish Times in 1969, she claimed, "I don't paint the Boyne Valley anymore. Somehow the place isn't the same since they've started all that excavation. To me, the mounds were interesting when you didn't know what was inside of them." And what I think she's making clear here is a sense that for her, the land, this kind of the mythology associated with the land was a sort of non-rational force. So the idea of uncovering or explaining or scientifically measuring these sites was a sort of insult to what she believed it represented, which was something that was non-rational, maybe even non-modern. And I do think that's worth dwelling on. It's a way of thinking about the world that is not about progress necessarily. And I think I think that Reid's work is interesting in that it doesn't sit necessarily or comfortably within the canon of modernism. She doesn't sort of pursue the same, she doesn't sit within a tradition in the same way as Mamie Jellett or Evie Hone, for instance, can be sort of placed next to Cubism. Reid's work is far less easily categorized, I think. And part of that, I think, is this refusal of the modern, this sense that, Reid was actually not interested in this idea of modernism as rupture. I think she's much more interested in continuity. And I think we see that in her work. She's interested in continuity of the land, continuity with the past, this sort of sense of a deep past that's represented by mythology. And there is an interesting point that Brendan Matthews makes in his contribution, that Reid was reacting to the excavations of Newgrange and the other Neolithic sites in the Boyne Valley, and that she gradually became less and less specific about the places she was painting. Certainly her titles ceased to refer to specific sites, and so that while earlier paintings, as I say, cited particular places, her Cave of the Firbolg, which is behind me, which won the Douglas Hyde Medal for Historical Painting in 1972. It could be anywhere. And Brendan speculates that perhaps here she's conjuring some as yet undiscovered, unexcavated, unspoilt place along the Boyne. In another interview around that time, she claimed she was no longer a painter of landscapes, but a completely abstract painter. Around this time, she's making a lot of these sort of definitive statements that I think are reacting to what's expected, and there's a little bit of maybe bullish overstatement in them as well. But it is clear that Reid's work does undergo another development at the end of the 60s towards a more fully abstract style. Her 1969 exhibition at the Dawson Gallery was really important in this respect. It was heralded by Brian Fallon, who was a long-standing advocate and admirer of Reid. He said that it marked a creative new wind on Reid's part. And Reid was also increasingly drawn to painting the sea and the movement of waves. Several of the works exhibited in her solo show at the Dawson Gallery in 1976 included some of these nautical preoccupations, and there's an example of one of those works is in the room inside. The title of which is just gone out of my head. But I think that's it. So this is, again, I mention all of this just as evidence of how her work continued to evolve and change. And along the way, inevitably, she disappointed some of those who would have preferred her to continue working in one particular style. But she also won new enthusiasts and patrons with each shift in her approach. So I was going to read from my conclusion to the text just to wrap up. And I suppose this is where I guess I return to this idea of refusal and a kind of an idea of artistic refusal as a sort of political or principled act. So in his 2016 book, Tell Them I Said No, the art critic Martin Herbert explores how acts of refusal have animated the work of a number of artists across the 20th and 21st centuries. Some now well known, as in the case of Agnes Martin, for instance, others less so, naturally enough, since this act of refusal tends to render an artist's work invisible. Some of the artists Herbert examines continued to make work after their abnegation, others gave up completely. Some even managed to turn the process of refusal into the material of their art. This kind of generative refusal is something Herbert examines at some length, exploring how such self-detachment pushes against the current in an epoch of celebrity worship. A big part of the artist's role now, in a massively professionalized art world, is showing up to self-market, being present. That's Herbert's words. And his critique is grounded in the post-conceptual international art world, but I do think his findings seem to resonate in relationship to 20th century Irish art too, as it underwent its own sort of fractured professionalization. He writes of the structural sexism that has motivated many such acts of refusal, what he calls exasperated reactions to the intolerability of the art world, to the limits of political potential, to gender bias, profiteering, the presence of repellent personalities and neon egos. And I think here we can maybe see some resonance in Reid's attitude and her contempt for commercialism and self-promotion, or what Herbert calls art's transmogrification into a backcloth for the power plays of the prosperous. Again, it's maybe excessive in terms of the language that he's using, but I really feel like it maps onto Reid's work in an interesting way. So in the face of such a situation, Herbert writes, and the hectic short-termism it demands of artists, some kind of voluntary retreat, some respect for the Joycean triumvirate of silence, exile, and cunning might constitute a vanguard. At the same time, I do think it would be incorrect to assume that Reid was necessarily isolated in the same way as some of the artists surveyed by Herbert. I mean, she remained connected to the art world. She was represented by the Dawson Gallery, and she continued to exhibit there and in other Dublin galleries and internationally, as well as in Drogheda and further afield. She continued to endorse and participate in the activities of new generations with their oppositional energies, seeking ways to carve out space for their work outside of or against the art establishment, as in the case of the independent artists and the figurative image group, as I've mentioned. So these activities seem to suggest a particular principle that may have motivated Reid's intransigence. Her sense that the cultural and artistic establishment was not simply a particular congregation of conservative-minded individuals, but a self-replenishing force that needed to be continuously rejected. So I'll finish by proposing that perhaps we could consider Reid's particular form of refusal alongside that articulated by Virginia Woolf in the late 1930s, when she was becoming increasingly outspoken about her political position. So in her 1938 book, 3 Guineas, Woolf proposed the formation of what she called a society of outsiders, a group of radical dissenters who could explore ways to resist the insidious mechanisms of patriarchy. This would be a society informed by feminist critique, though Woolf, like Reid, expressly refused the term feminism, wanting a more expansive term that could work to build collectivities that transcended gender. So she was proposing a sort of radical school outside of the city, outside of the capital or the received seats of learning, that would embrace obscurity, anonymity, poverty, and what she called freedom from unreal loyalties as the basic conditions of radicalism and resistance. And of course, Woolf was a really preeminent author at this point, one of the major authors of the period in England, a celebrity even. And so she was keenly aware of the paradox of somebody of her position advocating for obscurity, anonymity, and so on. Like Reid, her position was complex, so I think the terms of her refusal were complex too. Reid and Woolf were both resolutely independent-minded, conscious of their outsider status while also acknowledging certain privileges. Both were animated by a sense of justice and a keen awareness of the biases and exclusions enacted by the establishment upon artists in their position. Artists who felt compelled to resist, to refuse, risking obscurity, or even, like Melville's Bartleby, death by saying no. I'll leave it there.